This webinar will be recorded and archived, and the link will be available. So to begin, I want to welcome everyone for joining this webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Susan Patrick from iNACOL, and joining me is Chris Sturgis from Medicinet. We're the co-founders of Competency Works. You can find all of the information on competencyworks.org. And there's also a wiki there where we will be posting the links to the webinar and all of the slides. Today's webinar is focused on a reflection of the field of K-12 competency-based education. We spend quite a bit of time throughout the year of researching. We have an advisory board that helps inform us of developments in the field, both in policy and in practice. And we've done a number of interviews, and we'd like to share that information back out to the field. So once a year, we host a conversation online through this webinar format to help address what we're finding and to share out our reflections. We'd really like this to be an interactive webinar and encourage you to ask questions. We'll also be putting out guiding questions throughout the webinar. You can see in the lower left-hand corner of your screen a chat room where we encourage you to ask questions. We'll be moderating those questions, collecting them, and using specific times to address the questions with facilitation from the moderators. Remember, we'll have the slide deck available on the Competency Works wiki, and thank you for joining us. There'll be a series of prompts throughout the webinar too, where we'll be asking you questions as well. Thanks for joining us today. So here's the agenda for what we hope to accomplish today. We're going to take a look at the definitions of competency-based education and personalized learning. Understanding the basic definitions is really critical for the quality of implementations of these instructional models and how we're designing systems. The main focus of the webinar today is in part 2 and 3. It's reflecting on how competency-based education is progressing in the U.S. and analyzing the challenges and issues we're facing and taking a look at how we might address them. So with that, Chris, please let me turn it over to you. Thank you. So Chris, you'll want to toggle on the microphone in the top left. Thanks.
Got it. Thank you. Thanks, Susan. Hello, everybody. So our goal today is to reflect on the field and to learn from each other's perspectives. For those of you who are new to Competency Ed, we encourage you to listen to the introductory webinar that we had several months ago, and we'll be adding that link very soon. Now, our first discussion today is what is Competency Ed and how is our understanding changing? In the chat room, you can ask any type of question or comment. However, I think I went too many. How about that? But in the chat room, try to focus in on these two questions. How is your understanding of CBE changing? And what are the values, assumptions, and conditions that are necessary for CBE to be effectively implemented? Now, we go to this beautiful slide. In 2011, 100 innovators created a working definition of competency-based education, as every state used a different term, such as proficiency-based or mastery-based. We identified 5 elements, each one very powerful, but it is the combination of all 5 that creates the new infrastructure. Number 1, students advance upon demonstrated mastery. When students advance upon mastery, not time, educators can direct their efforts to where students need the most help. Students are more engaged and motivated when grading helps them focus on what they need to work on and show what they know. Students may spend more time working in those areas that are more difficult for them, and they may even advance beyond grade level in some domains, while taking more time in those that are more challenging or where they don't have the prerequisite skills. Number 2, explicit, transparent, transferable learning objectives empower students. Now, this intentionality and transparency also improve instruction. By making the learning objectives transparent, students have greater ownership over their education and more opportunity for choice in how they learn and how they demonstrate their learning. Students receive grades that help them understand how they are progressing towards the learning objectives The habits of work are assessed separately, and students are coached how to build these skills so they can become lifelong learners. Teachers become more collaborative with increased intentionality of what students need to know and be able to do. And working together, they improve instruction, assessment literacy, and build deeper understanding of learning progressions. Number 3, assessment is meaningful and a positive learning experience for students. This means that the assessments are actually rooted in the cycle of learning. The system emphasizes formative assessments because we all need feedback to be able to learn. And teachers need to be able to identify what those misconceptions are. To ensure that students are building higher order skills and are able to apply what they learn, schools increase the use of performance-based assessments. In the more advanced model, students take summative assessments whenever they are ready, rather than at set points in time. Number 4, students receive timely, differentiated support based on their individual learning needs. Every student struggles at one point or another. To keep engagement high and quickly address misconceptions before they become rooted in the student's understanding, competency-based schools provide flex time during the day for students to receive additional instructional support. When students don't complete a course within the semester, they focus on the specific skills they need to develop, not just retake the entire course. And our 5th element, learning outcomes emphasize competencies that include application and creation of knowledge, along with the development of important skills and dispositions. Success in college and careers takes much more than comprehension of the core academic subjects. Students need to become self-directed, lifelong learners with critical thinking, problem-solving, and cultural responsiveness skills to help them work in ever-changing, diverse workplaces. In order for students to develop these skills, they need to be actively learning with opportunities to apply their skills in new contexts. At the very heart of competency education is equity. The transparency of the system is absolutely transformative, where both students and teachers are more empowered to make decisions based on student educational needs and interests. Now, one of the things we are learning about is that it's very important to understand how the traditional education system limits our achievement. It's one thing to implement competency education, but we actually have to dismantle certain elements of the traditional system. The first one is the fixed mindset. The traditional system assumes that some students are smarter than others, and there isn't much anyone can do to change that. Thus, the traditional education system focuses more on ranking and sorting students to determine who gets to go on to college. And the traditional system is time-based. We know this. In the conventional system, students advance to the next grade level after a year of schooling, regardless of what they actually learn. Thus, many students become burdened with accumulated gaps in skills and knowledge that make it more difficult as they climb towards graduation. Now, there is a big danger here. With that combination of a fixed mindset and a time-based system, districts and schools have little reason to be more responsive to students or use continuous improvement techniques. The results are considered predictable, as some students are simply going to do better than others. Now, the grading systems depend on extrinsic motivation. Grading practices are organized around giving points for good behavior and doing well on tests and assignments. This works great for the students who receive the highest points and the best grades. However, for the rest of the students who are missing important prerequisite skills, this is an exercise in futility. The low grades only reinforce the fixed mindset that they can't learn, thereby undermining motivation and engagement in school. A 4th issue around the traditional system is the high variability in how teachers determine mastery. The lack of transparency in the traditional system has serious implications. The most serious is the variability of how we determine what it means to master something. Within schools, there is variability between teachers who each use their own system of grading, weighting how well students did on assignments and tests, and good behavior in their own unique way. Within districts and across states, some schools have much lower expectations than others. Imagine what it feels like as a parent who think their students are doing fine because they're getting A's and B's on the report card to find out that their child is reading 2 or more grade levels below their age-based grade. The high variability within the time-based system results in credits having little meaning. The high school diploma is a near meaningless certificate in terms of indicating what students know and are able to do, and the GPA, considered a powerful predictor for college success, is at best an indicator of the habits of work and the ability for students to effectively navigate the school environment. It's not of what students know and can do. And the fifth is very hard for us to dismantle. The traditional school is organized for efficiently delivering curriculum. Almost everyone in the United States has that shared experience of walking into a classroom, sitting in your desk in straight rows, the bell rings, we get quiet, we listen to the teacher, we take notes, we study, and often pure memorization, and that's how it goes through the whole semester. Now, the traditional school has actually been designed for teachers to efficiently deliver that curriculum and assess students. But we know that learning is a messy, messy process. Students bring different skills and life experiences to the classroom. They have misconceptions. They make mistakes. They become frustrated. They disengage. Schools need to be designed based on what we know about child development and the learning sciences. So, one of the things we're starting to really think about as we look at a competency-based education system are what are those values, assumptions, or conditions that need to be in place. We mentioned the fixed mindset in the traditional system. In the competency-based systems, we need to have a growth mindset. The policies, practices, and routines need to be developed so that students are building that growth mindset. Research is showing that low-income children are less likely to have a growth mindset. The schools need to help build it. A second issue is that we know that competency ed is designed around helping students master skills and content. No more passing students on with gaps in the learning. This means schools and teachers have to figure out what it is going to take to help students learn and address the gaps. It's pushing us towards continuous improvement. Third, the pedagogical philosophy is going to need to take into account how it fosters intrinsic motivation. If we're not going to use extrinsic, then we have to develop that intrinsic motivation. And fourth, the transparency and intentionality catalyzes educators to learn and build their skills in instruction and assessment. The first step is almost always calibrating proficiency by looking at student work. And fifth, competency education provides that structure that enables personalized learning. All students are held to the same high expectations and rigor. There's just much more flexibility when it is balanced with transparent, intentional, calibrated learning objectives. So that last point about personalized learning raises a challenge all of us have faced in that there continues to be confusion about the relationship between personalized learning and competency ed. One reason is that both of these phrases have been used and incorrectly used to describe digital instructional tools in the classroom. However, these technology-enabled blended and online modes are just that. They are delivery modalities. It's just about how the instruction or learning experiences are delivered. These terms are much more wide-reaching than delivery of instruction. This definition has been developed by Nicole of personalized learning, and as you can see, it focuses on tailoring learning experiences and empowering students to have, and this is going to have implications for district and school operations and design. So one way of putting these ideas together, and this is just one way, is to think about the roots, trunks, and leaves of a tree. The roots are those new values and assumptions, those conditions, if you will, that are needed to effectively implement competency-based education and personalized learning. The 5 elements of competency-based ed are the trunk. They provide the stability and ensure that we're really driving towards equity. And then the leaves are the personalized approaches, and there are so many different ways to personalize education. Schools aren't going to use every approach of personalized learning every time. They're likely to have learning plans. Hopefully they're going to be coaching around the habits of work, and they're going to have some level of choice for students. And then some schools may use individual extended learning opportunities, as in Pittsfield. Others offer group expeditions, such as at Casco Bay. Others will do capstone projects and exhibitions of student work, such as at Noble High School. Online learning can provide the flexibility and expand when and where students learn. The important thing to remember is that personalized learning and competency-based education go hand in hand. We need both of them. Okay, Susan, back to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. And I really want to emphasize that idea that you hit on. The big idea here is really around designing learning environments based on child development, what we know in the learning sciences and the research on how students learn best. And this core idea around competency education, developing mastery is critical, not allowing students to progress with gaps in their learning. learning hinges on prior learning. It's pretty straightforward. Then the learning sciences show that students want relevant ways to learn tied to their interests in the areas of their own passion. So having the same high expectations and common learning goals for all students, but recognizing there are different ways of attaining knowledge, skills, and these competencies is key. This is what we're really focused on in terms of this idea around personalized competency-based education. So now we're going to share out our reflections on how competency education in the U.S. has taken hold and how it's progressing. In the chat room, please feel free to share out progress in your school, district, or state. It's really helpful, too, to share out if there are organizations in your area that have been helpful and why. So please feel free to take on the chat room while we move ahead. So where we started, I think just a real brief context and history. In the 1970s and the 1980s, there was some work taking hold in the U.S. around mastery-based teaching practices. It was pretty hard to manage. There was a comment in the chat room earlier about, is this too much work? How can we help support teachers in taking on this work? And in Chugach, Alaska, and Chris just published a really great paper looking at the history of Chugach since 1994, moved to a district-wide system change towards competency-based education. There have been pockets of innovation since the mid-90s through the 2000s, Boston Day and Evening in 1995, schools like Diploma Plus in 1996, taking hold, developing competency-based models. When you look at state policy, Oregon allowed for proficiency-based credits in 2002. Rhode Island developed a proficiency-based diploma in 2003. New Hampshire has done significant work in competency-based education policy starting more than 10 years ago in 2005. So here's where we started in 2009, 2010. When Chris and I started working together, we recognized that there were these isolated pockets of innovators working on competency education in K through 12. Lots of people were using terms proficiency-based learning, mastery-based learning, performance-based learning, and that's fine. We want to honor the language that people use in their own local context. But there was no agreed-upon definition that actually explained what is it we are talking about fundamentally from a systems level. There were only a handful of technical assistance providers or organizations reaching out, able to work with schools to help on planning and design. No national advocacy organizations digging in and working on competency-based education. And the only real white paper was one from the U.S. Department of Ed in 2002. So there was a real need to update the literature and to create web-based resources to share and help understand where the field was. So we hosted a summit of 100 innovators that we found across the field and leaders in competency-based education to help develop this 5-part working definition that Chris shared, identify major issues in the field to address, and help build a network. And this was in 2011. 5 years later, here we are. We have Maine that has proficiency-based diplomas, Oregon requiring a proficiency in essential skills, and Colorado, state policy moving towards proficiency-based diploma, and a number of other areas of their state policy. So quickly, you can take a look at these maps. When we started looking across the U.S., examining these pockets of innovation, in 2012, these were the states who had done some work in state policy. And by 2016, we have 43 states that have taken on the work. So this has been expanding steadily and moving towards helping to provide more positive policy context for practitioners and educators to be able to develop competency-based systems. And make no mistake about it, this is an educator-led movement. This is coming from educators that are deeply committed to doing what's right for kids. And that has been incredible to watch the developments over the last 5 years. So quickly, in policy, with the new federal law passed in December, the Every Student... Oh, yeah. Yes. Sorry, Chris, did you want to jump in? Okay, thanks. The new federal education law passes, and it does intentionally create greater flexibility and recognizes the importance of personalized learning.
We lost you for a minute, but you're fine.
Yeah, please. Thanks. Okay. In a pilot for innovative assessments and accountability. In federal policy, there's also a focus on competency-based education in higher education, actually as well as in Perkins and career and tech. In state policy, as you saw from those maps, there's been quite a bit of movement. And I just want to highlight these 6 areas very quickly. Proficiency-based diplomas, which we've mentioned. Integrating competency-based education into the education code. In New Hampshire, they actually analyzed their education code to see where time-based practices were locking in traditional nodes, and redefining the Carnegie unit from time to competency development. Focusing on expanded learning has been in Colorado and New Hampshire. Recently, we see states taking on the creation of innovation zones to allow districts that are willing and ready to begin working on development of competency-based education zones, a place to innovate and bring forward the barriers that they're experiencing in state policy. So it becomes a partnership with the states and the districts in trying to further education. Competency-based education pilots, Ohio is a great example of that, even with some grant funding to help with the planning and the design. Other states are exploring competency-based education policies through task forces and initiatives. So Chris, let me turn it over to you. You've done quite a bit, hundreds of school visits to districts, and give an overview of your reflections on where we are now with the districts.
Yes, thanks, Susan. So what's happening in our districts, everybody? Well, you can read about it on Competency Works, but a couple of things. A very conservative estimate is that we think 4% of our districts are converting right now to competency-based education. It is probably higher than that. And then of those that are converting, we are seeing waves of improvement after the second year of implementation. And we're going to talk about this more later. We've had several states, such as New Hampshire and Maine, and Vermont's right there behind them, moving to scale with the expectation that all districts will be competency-based. And that we're also noticing that districts that have invested in blended learning are developing a very deep understanding of what it means to move to competency-based education. They may not have moved yet, but the leadership really understand it. So stay tuned, because we think we may have another wave of conversions. And we're delighted that we're seeing variations in models within districts, and of course some of the new models. But there's also something that we're seeing, which is that districts are still organized around grade level curriculum and not as much around how to deliver instructions or where kids are. And so that brings us to a few of the concerns. First, we're worried that we aren't seeing yet as many results as we'd like to. Second, a report from AIR found that implementation is inconsistent within schools. That's, of course, natural within any kind of implementation, but not something we want to see. And third, we aren't seeing direct benefits yet to special populations and students with gaps. It may be there, but we aren't hearing about it. So we're looking really hard for that. So a quick look at research and results, because people always want to know what's the evidence. We highly recommend reading Looking Under the Hood of Competency-Based Education by AIR for the insights into benefits for students and some of the implementation issues. Bravo to Windsor Locks in Connecticut. They were able to show gains this year in their elementary schools and got them out of the lower school status. And we're still operating on our hypothesis that the gains are only generated when schools actually organize instruction around student needs rather than covering grade level curriculum. All of the previous results that we've had in previous years all have that type of, have made that shift in order to get those results. Now, this is a new slide, and it is what we realized when we were looking is that we really can start to clump together stages of progression. So let's look at the top row. As Susan described earlier, the 1990s was the time of early innovations. We then saw the expansion of districts that all turned to competency ed because they felt the traditional system was just too much of a barrier. Then starting around 2012 and continuing today, there have been some investments in new models, such as the Carnegie Corporation's Opportunity by Design and the NGLC grant making. And there's also been dramatic expansion in New England because of the state policies there. And finally, right now, this last 2 years, we're seeing larger districts move towards competency education with a variety of approaches to scale, and we'll talk about that later. Now, if we look at the lower part of the timeline, we can see that there's waves of policy changes. Starting in 2002 to 2005, there several states either replaced the time-based Carnegie unit with a competency credit or introduced a competency-based diploma. Soon after that, we saw some field-building efforts that are here today still, such as the Competency-Based Pathways Summit, the launch of Competency Works, and in higher ed, the formation of the Competency-Based Education Network, which was all made up of institutions of higher education. The second wave of state policy was primarily systemic, such as the Colorado Proficiency-Based Diploma or Maine's powerful Bill 1422 that established a proficiency-based diploma and called for a standards-based system. And we also saw innovation zones, such as in Kentucky. We're now in a third wave of policy changes that are primarily characterized by pilots for states that don't want to jump in yet with both feet. However, we may see more states also follow Vermont's example and introduce comprehensive policies for personalization and proficiency-based education. The question facing us, and what we think about a lot, is whether we need to create a theory of action as a field as we expand to get to the next stage, a stage that really focuses on quality and equity. If we keep expanding without more attention to quality, will we actually be undermining ourselves in the long run? So now we're going to look at 5 trends, and I'm not going to read this slide because we're going to look at each one deeply. In the chat room, what we'd love to hear from you is about the trends you see happening in your communities or through your perspective. So the first trend is an increasing interest in competency ed. As we said, 4% of districts are converting, 2 states are reaching scale, 20 states have at least one type of school that you can point to of doing really moving towards a fully developed competency-based model. We've got 8 states starting pilots, 67 colleges have pledged to recognize proficiency-based transcripts. Shout out to New England Secondary School Consortium for doing that. And one report says there's up to 600 colleges and universities that are either in the design stage or have implemented competency-based programs. Now, we have this very improved policy context. ESSA has opened the door to great possibility. This is an opportunity to redefine student success for what it will take for students to be successful as a student, employee, family member, community member, and as part of participatory democracy. We have an opportunity to move beyond a single end-of-year assessment to systems of assessments that can identify exactly where students are in their learning, track individual growth, and occur at multiple points over the year to provide real-time data on student learning to empower students and teachers with rich data to customize learning. States can also include performance tasks in their systems of assessments to provide more meaningful information about students' abilities to apply knowledge. And while we hope that the Department of Education will adhere to the congressional intent of ESSA to allow states to design their own accountability systems, and keep the door open to innovative approaches to school report cards, we should not see the single summative score as a barrier to personalized learning or competency-based education. States can still design next-generation accountability systems that provide rich real-time data and spur continuous improvement if they choose to do so. And states are using a variety of strategies, and we're going to be releasing a paper next week looking at New England, where we really look at the types of strategies being used by states. And what we mostly see is what Great Schools Partnership describes as a goal-oriented strategy with supports. And we think there need to be more supports provided by the states, and we also think there needs to be more system building, such as what New Hampshire has done with the PACE initiative. Now let's take a look at these larger districts. The early district innovators and adopters were smaller sized districts in rural or suburban areas. And one of the big steps forward is that in the recent years is that larger districts are now embracing competency education. Now larger sized districts face two challenges smaller ones don't. First, they have to have strategies to engage much larger and often more diverse communities. And second, they have to think about scaling, not just rollout strategies. These four districts, Charleston County, Henry County, Lake County, and New York City, are all making progress. Charleston, Henry, and Lake have all used personalized learning coaches to support the transition. They've used some type of feeder school or cohort strategy. And one is expected the entire school in the cohort to become competency-based, while the others have rollout strategies within the leading schools. New York City, as a district, has not embraced competency education, but it is using a voluntary technique with schools joining the Mastery Collaborative. And right now, about 10% of the high schools are part of that collaborative. Now, these waves of innovation, this is tricky. It's really tricky to talk about this in the field, about what really makes a fully developed model, what it looks like, and then how schools are doing and creating them. The reason it's tricky is that what we're seeing is that schools move forward in waves. It's easy for any of us to visit a school and say, oh, they don't have enough rigor, there isn't enough innovation, they aren't designing to build intrinsic motivation, students aren't taking enough ownership. But what we're finding is that these waves of improvement are really important. After the first kind of stage where they set the intentional, transparent learning objectives, schools start to introduce improvements. And from their perspective, they feel like very important, huge innovations. Many immediately recognized after calibrating around student work that their emphasis has been on recall and comprehension. They begin to introduce performance assessments, and then they realize that their instruction isn't aligned either. Teachers quickly begin to work together to build their instructional strategies, to have more inquiry-based and applied learning. They may change their schedules. And others realize that there's much more they can do regarding student agency, voice, and choice. More effort will often be placed on what the habits of work really mean and how to coach students effectively. Others open doors to leadership opportunities within the school for students to participate in. And we're also seeing many schools start to shift the emphasis towards more skill so that skills and content are more balanced. One school said they went from about 80% content, 20% skills to about 50-50. So the implication for all of us in the field to be able to learn from each other is that we have to have language that can talk about these stages and talk about what stage schools anticipate next. Now, let's quickly just talk about the field, that set of organizations that support all the schools and districts and states. This page represents the national organizations focusing on competency ed in some way. And please, in the chat room, we'd love to hear about which organizations are making a difference for you in your region. Who do you turn to for help? To date, these organizations supporting the field have continued to expand and have relatively high levels of openness and collaboration. More organizations has meant more amplification and at times more confusion, and we're trying to keep an eye on that. And we're seeing a bit more competition for funds, but in general, a collaborative spirit still characterizes the field, and it's probably part of the reason that we've been successful. Now, we also, when we started, there was very little literature on this topic. Most of the research had been done based on the 1980s mastery-based learning classroom techniques. And so we've made great strides as a field filling this gap. This one picture is just of what was produced in the last year. So again, we have a question for you for the chat room. What do you think are the most important resources or documents to read if you were to recommend to somebody else, not just on this page, but from anywhere? And then what do we still need research and resources on? So one of the things we started to do is reflect on how we're progressing in terms of quality, equity, scaling, sustainability. And we really push ourselves. So these are the types of questions that Susan, myself, and the Competency Works team and the folks in the field talk about. In terms of quality, we think there's two major issues. First, what does a robust model look like with high levels of student agency, deeper learning, and strategies to meet students where they are? And then second, what are the quality indicators that could help us know if schools are going in the right direction? How do we know if a school is implementing effectively? Equity, we're concerned that the traditional ways of thinking about equality and equity aren't actually that helpful within a personalized approach. So we're starting to think about how do we frame equity in a way that recognizes students enter with different skills, and we want to make sure they're making progress. How do we meet students where they are without tracking? And then what are the implications for proficiency-based diplomas given the cultural importance of graduating at age 18? Yes, we can have kids stay in school longer, but they don't necessarily want to stay any longer. Scaling, we're building a lot of knowledge about how to scale within states and gaining early insights, as we talked about larger districts. We still need to figure out how to make it easier to learn about competency-based education and implement it. And then sustainability, we're doing pretty well. Proud, as long as the community engagement with dialogue, not just buy-in, but with dialogue, is part of the process of implementation, we will be positioned well with sustainability. The question is whether we should be building more intentional strategies across the field to build coalitions to support competency education, especially if opposition starts to grow. So let's just take 2 minutes to check in with the chat room. Susan, is there anything we should talk about here?
Well, there's really some interesting questions. I know a few of them sprinkled throughout we're going to touch on later, so I'm going to hold those until we hit on some of those ideas in the next few slides. But there's one interesting comment from Suzanne Thompson, and you might want to unpack this a little bit, Chris. It was one word that's been used frequently over my years of teaching is the importance of scaffolding and the importance of engagement. I worked primarily in New York City schools, and they were big on programs that created personalized and engaging instruction. I didn't know, we didn't talk a lot about instruction, we have limited time here, but unpacking that sort of focus on scaffolding and how it relates to competency-based education might be helpful.
Okay, so I would call this as one of my personal inquiry areas. Wherever I go now, I talk to teachers about scaffolding. Because when we talk about delivering grade level curriculum and then offering scaffolds, and then I ask the teachers, if a student is 3 years below grade level and is actually missing prerequisite skills, does the scaffolding help them build those prerequisite skills so that next week when you're working on another project, they're actually able to do it? Or do you have to keep providing scaffolds? And the answer always tends, I would say 90% of the time, is the scaffold allows students to access a curriculum, and that's how it's defined in the field from what I can tell. It does not help them build the prerequisite skills. So we continue to spend time and energy to create these scaffolds, but we're actually not helping the kids get the skills they need to be successful in next week, next month, next year's classes. An example I use also is there's a lot of high schools and middle schools will use lower level text in social sciences and say that the students are getting the same content and it allows them to stay on track with the rest of the grade level. When I spoke with folks at the Young Women's Leadership Academy in Astoria, they said, oh, no, 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 no. We use one text and then we do close reading with the students who really need extra help. Now, I don't know what that looks like if you've got 2/3 of your kids all at a different reading at a much lower grade level. So we have to think this out about what the concentration of that dynamic is in the classroom. But if that's in fact what we need to be doing is more close reading and intensive, but staying focused on that closer to that grade level curriculum, that's a very different strategy. So I believe that the scaffolding right now should be unpacked, looked at, and in a very precise way begin to frame the challenges around how we make sure that kids actually build the skills they need for more advanced work. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, it was great, Chris. Thanks. And Rose Colby put a great comment related to scaffolding. Rose, I don't know if you have access to a microphone and want to toggle on the talk just for a moment to weigh in here, but we're grateful for you being on the webinar. Wanted to give you a chance to weigh in. So I'll go ahead and step in if we see the microphone here. But Rose, just Chris, so you know, as Rose commented, I've used scaffolding as meeting a student where they are at in their learning and then supporting them as they move forward. Scaffolding in the traditional sense means to support kids to their grade level curriculum, often overlooks learning gaps they have. And then there are a number of other excellent comments that follow on that, but thank you for that explanation. It was extremely rich and interesting, and I think this points to maybe a need to dig in on this topic in some of our future blogs. So please know this feedback on the webinar is really important, and just to reiterate the point Chris made earlier, please know us what resources you need us to be developing on issues that you're facing. So Chris, back to you.
Great. Okay, so the challenges before us. So Susan and I are going to do something now. We're going to talk about both implementation challenges and systemic challenges, building on what we've been talking about in the chat room. What we'd love to hear from you are what are the biggest challenges you're encountering, and what do you think could be done to address these challenges, either as a local or national initiative. This might be for an organization to do. This is also very valuable information for funders to hear from the field, and we think that Competency Works can be a conduit for helping that kind of reflection for foundations. So 5 implementation challenges. The first one is the issue of what we were just talking about, how to meet students where they are, both those that are missing prerequisite skills, and then I saw a note in the chat room, and also those above grade level. This is not a simple question, and it's clear we need to take into consideration social emotional learning of the students, learning sciences, age and development, academic domain, and the concentration. Susan, do you want to give us an idea about what might help us solve this issue?
Yeah, and I think it does point to that question in the chat room around considering how we meet students where they are, both students that are behind or high ability learners that may be ahead. When you think about some of the fundamentals of competency-based education, it's about having learning progressions along a trajectory and meeting kids where they are. So these equity challenges actually allow us to have more transparency in teaching students at their readiness level and addressing it. So, I mean, the solution is around actually meeting kids at their readiness levels and addressing those gaps, or giving them the tools to be able to move on when ready and move ahead and dig deeper. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so the second one is we're seeing more and more entry points and different pathways in how districts and schools implement competency-based education, how they get started and how they move forward. And this is fantastic because there's no way that's right. We might get better and better ways. But it's also making it more difficult to transfer knowledge. So we've been thinking about how do we begin to understand these different entry points and support them to provide choices in districts and schools, and also provide the right set of tools. Okay, Susan, do you have an idea for a solution?
Well, I just say I'm seeing this a lot when practitioners are visiting other schools. You bring a lot of your own perspective in with you and where your own entry points are, and it's really important that we take an approach of a growth mindset and recognizing those different entry points for different local contexts, and hold our high expectations for what a true system looks like, a competency-based system. So let's work on being critical friends to each other and sharing a lot of information, but do it in the process of building understanding and being sensitive to those different entry points and maturity levels.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, the next one's about community engagement and not just buy-in. So as more states pull together, like Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, it moves from just educators doing this because they want to do it and because they can't tolerate working in a traditional system anymore to an expectation that they're going to do it. And so we're concerned that we want to make sure that community engagement is always part of that process, that it's a dialogue and not just buy-in. And we're also concerned that we need to have different types of tools to help all of us, from whatever perspective we're at, both communicate the big ideas of where we're going, but also address these misconceptions that the opposition, we don't even want to call them opposition, that the critics are bringing in. And it's primarily critics who haven't taken the time to visit a competency-based school and think it's just online learning. But still, they're there, and we need to be able to talk to them about it. So Susan, ideas for how we handle that one?
I just say there's a great resource in the book, Delivering on the Promise, which really digs in on the community engagement strategy. I think a real solution, and this is a unique historic opportunity in American education where the shift is back to states and localities, this is the time that we should be engaging our communities in a conversation around what does success look like? What do we want our graduates to know and be able to do? That foundational conversation is true community engagement. It's not just one conversation around the goals and around what communities will be doing and looking for in partnership with their school systems. So really thinking about real community engagement, and that being an ongoing factor in asking the question around redefining student success and goals for what a graduate is and what that means.
Great. So waves of innovation, we've talked about this both as something that's very exciting, but can also be a bit of an implementation challenge. So how could we be able to better draw on the broad set of knowledge in education to make it easier and more discussable, so as competency-based schools move through these waves, that we can expedite that so they're not always reinventing the wheel? Susan?
Oh, I think that just highlights the point, and this is a long game. I mean, this is a long-term move towards systemic improvement, and so we need to be prepared for that. Our system is often focused on short-term goals. Some of that's created in policy context, but the waves of innovation do take time, and we need to, as part of the solution, build that in on the expectations with community and as our work progresses. Great point. Okay, so the last one's tricky, everybody, and it's really about leadership for all of us. We find that trust, or the lack thereof, is often one of the challenges. We've heard policymakers comment that they don't trust that teachers can build the skills to calibrate performance assessments.
Yet New Hampshire is actually doing that. They're proving that they can. And so undergirding that is some lack of trust, respect, growth mindset for ourselves as adults. And it's also causing us to dismiss models when they're not fully developed and not see what the contribution is and where people can move forward. There's also another issue, and that is, are we in fact trustworthy as a field if we continue to have as little diversity at meetings as we do? Now, this is a problem mostly of white folks going to meetings with a lot of white folks and feeling that it's okay. But the question is, does that make us untrustworthy? And how do we, as a field, become trustworthy, especially at a time when our country is dealing with these long-standing systemic issues of racism? Susan, that's now to you. That's a tough one to solve.
Yeah, well, Chris, I just want to highlight this issue of trust. I know you talked about this, but I mean, I just returned from being over in the European Union meeting with leaders there for 2 weeks, and there's a big difference in how countries can address moving towards a world-class education for every student and global education if their system allows for some trust, and whether their system is built on one of mistrust. And right now we're really, it's become more and more clear to me, in a system that doesn't trust each other. The federal government doesn't trust states, states don't trust localities. We are not focused on a long-term goal of building educator capacity, and we absolutely need to. If there's any hope in America of transforming our education system, it is about building educator capacity and really resetting the definition for a broader definition of student success on what we want our kids to know and be able to do. That is competency-based. And that trust and respect is going to have to be designed within a system that seeks out that continuous improvement and transparency, because we've just got to change towards this more shared vision. The strategies are going to be very difficult if we continue in a system that's just built on this distrust. So I'll put that out there. This higher order skills and this inquiry-based focus is absolutely for students to be able to engage in the world that they live, but it's also about educators and practitioners being able to build that trust and capacity too as professionals. So we can shift now. Yeah, Chris, did you want to I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, I was just shifting us to system challenges. Take it away.
Great. So I'm going to highlight 5 system challenges. Chris touched on the 5 big implementation challenges, and I know that there have been some other challenges that have come up in the chat room, like the alignment to higher ed, which are real, they're being addressed. On the system challenges, let me just highlight number 1, which is what I was just mentioning, human capital, educator and leader preparation. When we ask ourselves, who is ready for designing, launching, and implementing personalized and competency-based education? So this is a big challenge for the system. And Chris, I don't know if you have thoughts for how we might think about addressing this.
Well, a couple of things. States could certainly be convening their deans of education to talk about this. I actually think MOOCs could be helpful in this area, and certainly more regional collaboratives to support leaders as they build more adaptive leadership strategies is something that could help.
Thank you. The second issue is around the alignment of accountability and assessments with competency-based education. We could spend an entire hour or actually an entire day talking about this. I will point to some webinars that we've recently done on opportunities within ESSA. But the point is, as a system, one of the key challenges that we're identifying right now is to better align our accountability and our assessments for continuous improvement that would better function a competency-based education system. The third area is around addressing issues of institutional racism and white privilege. People need to understand that the traditional system is designed to rank and sort kids. When you think about transcripts and GPAs, a school of 1,000 students, it's all about ranking and sorting kids. It's not about ensuring that every single student graduates career and college ready with the skills that they need to succeed. This is a big contrast to what I saw as goals in other global education systems. And we're so used to this that sometimes we don't even see it. So one of the biggest challenges that we have is to think about how our system can be designed, a competency-based education system, to focus on helping every student achieve those high levels. The biggest challenge also is around the societal and institutional racism and the differences in expectations. And I have to tell you, in my travels, I get comments from people all of the time, and I don't think it's intentional, but we have to be able to talk about this, think about how we can talk about this in a way to get people to listen, not shut down, but open up their eyes to the truth about some of the system designs that are ranking and sorting kids, helping them understand the truth about what's possible, that all students can succeed and have this growth mindset and feel empowered to change. So I think it's really important as a field that we think about how we communicate competency-based education and also think about the different needs across racial and socioeconomic groups. Chris, did you want to add or? Chris, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but feel free to jump in. The last, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I was on. I wasn't. I do think taking the implicit bias test can be really helpful for people to, all of us, to take out, to try to clean out bias from our own lenses. And I'm taking like one a week now just to kind of keep myself thinking about what bias I might be bringing to anything I do.
Thanks, Chris. Great point. The last two system items, and I know we're running out of time here, but looking at inadequate research and evaluation to inform practice and policy. And then the last of the five are thinking about how to continue improvements in the information learning management systems and new metrics. This really requires us to look across learning trajectories at the whole learner profile and getting the right tools to support teachers in personalizing learning is really important. Many of the tools that exist today in terms of technology are really built around the traditional system. So there's been a lot of progress through Summit's program with Basecamp, working with districts across the country, and a number of other tools like Educate that are being used. And those of you that are using tools, feel free to type in the chat box those tools that have been helpful for you. But also the idea around new metrics and really looking at how we're helping support students and what those new metrics might be. So Chris, in wrapping up, let me turn it back over to you.
Well, we're actually going to turn it to Natalie. Natalie, do you want to talk about what's coming up at iNicole 16?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this incredible webinar as much as I did. We're just finishing up here, and I can share a few details about our upcoming iNACOL Symposium right around the corner, October 25th to the 28th in San Antonio. It really is the premier event for leading innovators in competency education. So if you haven't yet registered, you can register today. The link to register is right there in the chat box for you. You can also follow the conference chatter using hashtag iNACOL16 up there at the top of the slide for you. And here on the slide are a few competency education specific events, activities that are going to be happening in San Antonio that you really don't want to miss. So on October 25th, we are hosting a full day pre-conference workshop. So that's 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. to really dig into personalized competency-based education. And that's going to be led by Dr. Kristen Brittingham of Charleston County. And then later that same day, we're going to hold a Competency Works meetup at 6 p.m. So that's going to be during the President's reception in the exhibit hall. So you can just find the Competency Works Lounge and network with other innovators and leaders in this field. And then throughout the symposium itself, we have a dedicated track to competency education. So what does that mean? Sessions, workshops, meet the practitioner sessions, meet the experts, and there's tons of details about all of those on Chris's August 17th blog that we can also share in the chat box with you as well. So thank you all for attending today. I know it's a couple minutes after 3. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. We're here to help, and we will provide you a follow-up email with links to today's webinar, and you can download the slides as well. So with that, we hope you have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you in San Antonio.